Right. Good morning, friends, and welcome on this wonderful sunny day out there. And it's going to get warm, I'm told. So have fun later. Only later. Don't have fun now. Anyway, today we have a very interesting talk by Air Francois, who is going to speak on fair trade, something I think we all remember, even when it started, which was a long time ago, I am informed. But anyway, less of my ramblings on. So,
Thank you, Ray. Morning, everybody. It's very good to see everyone. I can see Hattie's head, but not her face. Hi, Hattie. Yes, thank you very much for, approaching me and asking me if I'd do something about fair trade. And in the process of thinking about doing it, I obviously contacted Rosie, who is a strong fair trade colleague in this part of North Somerset, as well as being connected in many other ways. So Rosie's going to contribute to what's going to be said, and we'll try and answer any questions towards the end. We may or may not know the answers, but we will certainly try. So it's lovely for me to have Rosie here in this group. The other thing that I thought about when I was asked was that I know you've heard quite a lot about Cuba um, over the months from Hattie. And I went to Cuba in 2015 on a fair trade trip. So it seemed as if it would be quite good to sort of segue from what you've heard in the past from Hattie through my experience in 2015 in Cuba, and then come more up to date. Because both Rosie and I have been involved as part of what we've done with Fairtrade in setting up Fairtrade, for me, a Fairtrade village. And Rosie is in the process of creating a Fairtrade town in Portishead. So we've got that kind of experience, which is much wider than, well, it's part of our, I think I'm right in saying, Rosie, it's part of our passion to try and do
yep.
this. And we'll come back to that. And the other thing is that, whilst Fairtrade's really well known now, well embedded, 30 years old this year with the Fairtrade mark, not with Fairtrade as an activity, but the mark that is on everything that is certified Fairtrade is 30 years old this year. So those are kind of some of the strands that I thought it was important to try and pull together. And then towards the end, maybe some questions about why and how friends are supportive of fair trade, and maybe some questions around that. And peppered in will be 5 quiz questions, which are not, serious quizzing, just to get us thinking about what we know or don't know about fair trade. So I think what I'm going to do first is just make the links to Cuba. So on this hot day, let's go to Cuba. I'm going to just hang on, screen share. Um, so, can you all see the slide?
Yes,
Yes.
and we can see the slide sorter as well. So we're not seeing just the slide; we're seeing actually what looks like we're seeing the list of slides down the side.
Okay. Okay. I don't think I'm going to worry about that too much because there's only 9 slides. So rather than take time readjusting everything, you happy to go with it?
They're jolly good.
Yeah. Okay. So onto this, I've actually put Fairtrade in Cuba, Pill, and Portishead, just to locate us in a global setting. And these photos are just glimpses of Cuba in 2015. There's a company called Saddle Skedaddle, and they do a lot of cycle tours, including cycle tours to Cuba. But they, over the years, have developed some fair trade trips in their portfolio. They're still doing some of them. In fact, they're still doing, I find out, the trip to Cuba. So this is not cycling. It's a trip to Cuba to see Cuba, but it also involves visiting any fair trade projects that they can find. Now, that's difficult in Cuba now. It was much more possible in 2015. So they also do trips to other parts of the world, to parts of Africa and parts of India that have fair trade projects that are active. So when I spoke to them the other day, they said, well, we're still doing trips to Cuba, but finding fair trade projects is really difficult. And we'll come back to that. But in 2015, it was wonderful to see what was going on in Cuba. So let's just move on. So I think when Hattie was talking to you one time, she mentioned Jose Marti, who is, you know, a sort of honored, revered hero in Cuba. And what he was saying, which is painted on the walls of many places we visited in Cuba. In Spanish, it's el hombre crece con el trabajo que sale de sus manos. And in English, that means man grows through the work of his hands, or the products that come from his hands. So it's very much this injunction to work hard, and that through work you will grow, and indeed you will honor Cuba in this context. So wherever we went, we saw this quote: man grows through the work of his hands. And while we were there, we visited lots of places that had comercio justo, over the top, fair trade. We saw it in lots of places on hand-painted signs. This is over the door into a canning factory, canning guava at the time, and some mango, which was a new project funded through Fairtrade and accredited through Fairtrade. So we saw both the growing and this little bit at the time. Remember, this is 2015, have to qualify it all the time, really, now about Cuba. But this was a commercial canning factory funded through Fairtrade. And it makes me smile because in other parts of, well, in the UK, there's always talk about protecting the mark, protecting the brand of fair trade. And in Cuba, we saw it spelt in slightly different ways. We saw it in different colors. We saw it in different fonts on the tops of farms and co-ops. That was far less important than telling people that they were part of the fair trade movement. So it's just an interesting observation, I think. My highlight trip from all the farms we went to was this one, which was a herb farm. I'm not sure that my photo does full justice to the rows and rows and rows of herbs. And as you walked in, you were overwhelmed by the smell, or the scent, I should say. It was just a cornucopia of herbs. And in Cuba at that time, they were experimenting with growing and drying herbs through fair trade, which was why we went to visit it. A lot was also sold on the street corner, because as I'm sure you know, in Cuba, every bit of land has been used for growing as much as possible. Middles of roundabouts, sides of streets, farms themselves, which this was. And this man here, Alex, was our guide. He took us round Cuba. He introduced us to farmers. This is the farmer who owns this herb farm. But it was an absolute delight and pleasure and treat for the senses. to go to this particular herb farm. So it's a fond memory for me. The other thing that was a highlight was going to a farm and being given lunch. Now, I don't know about you, Hattie, but my experience in Cuba in 2015 was that lunch wasn't often as varied and glorious as this. Lots of rice and beans, but not a lot else. Here, the farmer had laid out rice and beans, but vegetables, tomatoes, other things that we could enjoy. And it was an amazing, amazing feast. And in the foreground was a carton of fruit passion, which was then one of the Fairtrade fruit juices that you could buy in the UK. So there it is, orange juice, fruit passion. The sad story is that there's no Fairtrade fruit juice from Cuba now. In fact, there's very, very little that's Fairtrade certified. And Hattie can perhaps help in this, but my understanding from speaking to people is that Cuba needs everything it produces to feed its population. The degree of change since 2015 to now is severe. We were there just as Cuba was opening up again, and Obama was keen to open up talks and links with Cuba. That's not so much the case now. And so fruit passion, as far as I know, is not available. And this has happened with one or two areas of the world that have been producing fair trade products. So I'm showing this to say how wonderful it was to be at that meal, but also to show the fragility of fair trade certification in certain parts of the world as well, and why we need to keep campaigning about it. But it was a lovely day and it was a lovely meal, and the farmers were just delighted to have us there. They were Cubans who spoke fluent French because they had French connections in their family. So those of us that spoke French were able to chat away to them. They were wonderfully hospitable. I think the next slide is another example, yes, of then people benefiting, here at the bottom, beneficiada por comercio justo. So they were funded by Fairtrade, and they were growing fruits mainly. And they were a really good example of where the Fairtrade premium, which is, I expect you know, but I don't want to tell you things that you know, but it's worth sort of remembering this, that the Fairtrade premium is always part of getting the certification. So on top of a fair price for everything that the Fairtrade farmer produces, the community gets the premium. And this is the only certification that does that. So the other certifications, are going obviously some way to improving the conditions of the farmers. That's not to be denied. But this premium, which goes back to the community, is unique to the Fairtrade certificate. And here they had the community meeting, trying to decide what they were going to do with their premium once it was paid to them. They thought long and hard. They wondered about a very loud sound system for their social centre so that they could dance and have music playing. They wondered about that. Then they wondered whether that was serious enough. So they talked to the Fairtrade certification people, and they said, well, what's going to help your community to grow? And they said, well, music. Music would help us tremendously when we finish work. If we can dance, if we can hear music, we're going to be a better community. So part of their premium, they paid on this sound system. Another part, they paid towards better health screening in the community. So that's just an example of how the premium can really come to life and really help communities. So we might come back to that, but it's a good example. The other place we went to visit, sorry, just go back. The other place we went to visit was a coffee plantation. Not now actually producing coffee, but there as a monument to those enslaved people who grew coffee in Cuba. And like all these visits, it was extremely moving, extremely moving. This was one of the buildings, and this was our guide, Alex, standing in the middle of a stone circle, which was originally where enslaved people would have ground the coffee by pushing round a wooden bar. So they stood in a circle, 3 or 4 of them, and they pushed round a grinder that ground the coffee beans. And none of this is here now. It's one of those rather empty sites, but with these very poignant reminders of enslavement. We also visited there and climbed the observation tower of the coffee plantation. There were several of these towers, and there were people at the top watching all the time, watching to see if anybody was trying to escape. And if you go to the top of one of those and you look out over this vast plantation and you think of the lives of those people, for me, it was yet another reminder, very sobering, but an encouragement to keep going with any movement which can not change the history, but move us forward to better times. And so that's another highlight of my Cuban trip. So I'm just watching time. There we are. And that was Cuba nearly 10 years ago. And here we are now with Fairtrade 30 years on. So I hope we can kind of sort of bridge those two things. And I'm going to stop share screening now, unless anybody wants to ask anything at this moment about the Cuban link. Okay.
What year was it you were there?
2015.
Okay, cool.
So I'll stop sharing. Great. Now I'm back with you on the screen.
I was just going to say.
Carry on.
I was just going to say that I can't remember seeing anything about Fairtrade when I was there, and I was there in 2015 as well. And not that I was particularly looking, but there was that was also a time when they had the government allowed farmers to sell 10% of their produce privately, so they had private markets in for the public, and if you had money, you could go and spend on different fruit and veg and stuff that you hadn't been able to get on your ration cards.
Yeah, I remember that as well, because we saw those markets as well. And yeah, I mean, the point about you didn't see it is that across the whole island, obviously, there is so much growing, and the number of Fairtrade projects then was quite small, and they'd been sought out for this idea of going and meeting producers. So it's not that, yes, you see it everywhere, or I saw it everywhere then. So I agree. Often the projects that Fairtrade certifies are small cooperatives. They're very small undertakings, but they're very significant to the population, to the local population. There are some bigger examples, and we'll come to some that we kind of know more, that market themselves very highly in the States and in the UK. But often it is very small. So I think that's absolutely right as part of the picture, Hattie. I'd agree. Yeah.
And when we went to the market, we were told not to buy anything and to just walk straight through and hardly make eye contact, basically, because foreigners were not really allowed to be in these markets.
Yeah.
And Cubans are very direct. I mean, I remember one time we were doing a cycling trip, and I lifted the cycle over the curb onto the sort of pavemented area in the middle of the square, where in the middle there was a monument. And a guy came straight up to me and said, "You can't put the bike on there, or you can't cycle on there." Really direct.
Mm. Mm. Yes, it's that kind of combination, isn't it, of kind of freedom and spontaneity and a heavy hand of you know, what's right and what's wrong. I think, you know, I thought that was a really interesting sort of mix at the time. The other thing that I remember, mobile phones were not really present in 2015, certainly not for Cubans. But we went to the harbour at Havana one night, and our guide said, "We do have the internet. We do have the internet. Look, there it is." And all the way along the line of the wall of the harbour of Havana were young people who were talking to each other and passing conversations along the line. And he said, "Where's our internet? That's what we've got at the moment. That's how we keep in touch." And it was massive, massive of young people sitting on the wall, swinging their legs, talking to each other and passing messages along. I'll never forget it. So there we are. That's a little bit more about Cuba. As far as fair trade is concerned, I was just thinking that maybe before we go any further, I'll just give you these quiz questions. There are only 5 of them. It doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong. It's just about raising our awareness about fair trade before Rosie and I go on to talk about what we've been doing. So, see how we go. Which company famously and deliberately splits their fair trade chocolate bar into uneven chunks? Hattie.
Sorry. My computer says it has loads of resources, and so I missed out some words, in particular, very important words in this question.
Shall I say
Please,
it
could you
again?
repeat it? Which company
famously and deliberately splits their fair trade chocolate bar into uneven chunks? Is it Seed and Bean? Is it Whitaker's? Is it Tony's Chocolonely? Or is it Pico, which is a very small chocolate certified bar? Anybody got any ideas?
Again, I've got a sound difficulty and also delivery all time Zoom because you move to and fro, and sometimes I can't see it. But I've never heard.
Hattie, you're breaking up. I'm not sure what's going on.
You're breaking up, Hattie.
Yeah.
It's low resources.
Okay. You can't do anything about it? No. Okay. It is Tony's Chocolonely, who did this, well, you know, to illustrate the disparities in the world. So you don't get the same size chunk when you open the bar. They are passionate about fair trade and about now what they're calling slave-free chocolate. That's one of their new marketing strap lines. So watch out for Tony's Chocolonely all over Bristol, in all good places where you can get coffee as well, often fair trade. But it's an interesting way of expanding the idea behind fair trade, which is obviously about fair shares for everybody, be you the producer, be you somewhere else in the supply chain, and to be fair as a shopper. So it's an interesting one. How about this one? Greggs is one of the easiest places to grab a fair trade tea, coffee, or hot chocolate, and in some Greggs, orange juice. What are the 3 main colours in Greggs shops, their branding? Is it red, blue, and grey? Is it blue and black? Or is it blue, orange, and white? Or is it green, orange, and white? So you've got 4 choices. Red, blue, and grey, blue and black, blue, orange, and white, or green, orange, and white. How many of us have been to Greggs ever?
Yeah.
I'm not catching that word. How many of us have been to
Greggs?
Greggs.
The bakers, the takeaway.
Oh, right. Right.
Have a go, anybody. Hey.
Green, orange, and white.
Close, but not right. It's blue, orange, and white. Greggs are a family company, and a few years ago, they decided to move over to sourcing fair trade tea, coffee, chocolate, and sometimes orange juice when they can. And it's an interesting example because it's not the obvious fair trade supporter, but they're on the high street, they're on railway stations, they're all over the place. So the partnership with them is very important. They travel a fine line, I think, between making it their absolutely dominant message, but they do in the shops have good signage. And the important thing with all these places that support fair trade, I think, is to go in and just make sure it's still fair trade, you know, so some sort of conversation over the counter about, so is your coffee still fair trade? I hope so. You know, that makes such a difference to a company if they're trying to step outside the, you know, the main field. So that's why I put that question in. So do go into Greggs. It's maybe an unlikely place, I don't know. But on the railway station, their coffees are good. Okay, the word banana, and there are lots of fair trade bananas around, derives from the Arabic word. Is it the Arabic word for oar, as in a ship's oar, caterpillar, finger, or crab?
Wow.
The word banana, what does it originate from? Have a go. I mean, you know, it's not about right and wrong. Hattie, have a go.
Finger.
Finger. Okay, we're agreed, nodding heads. Yeah. We talk about a hand of bananas, and the word banana comes from the Arabic for finger. Okay. Which country produces the most coffee? Is it Indonesia, Brazil, Ethiopia, or Colombia? Not necessarily fairly traded, just as a coffee producer. Brazil, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Colombia.
Colombia.
The most coffee. Any ideas?
I think
Not sure.
I think it would be Brazil just because they're bigger, but of course it doesn't figure.
Well done. Well done.
It's
Well done.
There's an interesting counterintuitive partner to that. Which country sells the most coffee?
Oh yes. Mm.
And the answer is Germany, because they import from everywhere else and process it and re-export it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, David. Yes, yes. There's another twist in the supply chain story, isn't it? Yeah, right. Last one. Okay. I don't expect you to know the answer to this necessarily, but it's interesting. Fairtrade currently supports 1,305 biodiversity guardians in the world. These are people specially appointed through Fairtrade certification to be concerned and to be proactive about the biodiversity where they are growing. And they are together protecting the biodiversity of farmland, which is the same size as, is it New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Cyprus, or Wales? It may be difficult to know, but it's an interesting fact. It is, in fact, Wales. The size of Wales is protected in land terms by these biodiversity guardians who are appointed from within the community. They are already Fairtrade certified, but the way they are growing obviously takes biodiversity seriously into account. And another thing about fair trade products is that very, very many of them, I can't give you a percentage, are organic in the way that they are produced. And that was something we saw in Cuba. I mean, of course, Cuba is highly organic, wonderful wormeries in that herb farm, wonderful wormeries. Everything is totally organic. So, you know, Fairtrade has a very good pedigree with organic growing because of where it's being grown. In Cuba, it's a particular reason, but, you know, it's a good thing, again, to know and to be able to say about a lot of fair trade products. So onwards to much more close to home, really. how support for fair trade works on the ground, and whether it's, I suppose the question I'm posing really is it working well enough, support for fair trade within Friends, within Quakers? It's a question I'd quite like to chew around a little bit in a while. But Rosie, I wonder whether you'd like to pick up and tell us something about the adventure of becoming a fair trade town.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sue. Just to say that when I lived in Pill, I was part of the Pill Fairtrade group, and they were a certified Fairtrade village. And of course, every so often had to renew that certification. It wasn't just a one-off, and you had to continue to show that you were proactive in promoting fair trade. And the group suggested that perhaps as we had Quakers in Portishead, that we might try and set up a fair trade group and work towards Portishead becoming a fair trade town. So our local meeting agreed that Pat Thurston and I would be representatives, and off we set and tried to find some other people locally to make a start. We had a launch in 2020, and the only picture I'm just going to show you, see if you can see, the speaker was a lady from Nicaragua, pardon me, the lady in yellow. And her name, I have to call it out because it's quite long. She was a coffee and cocoa farmer, and her name was Gloria Maria Talavera Gonzalez. And she had come over as part of Blink, B-L-I-N-C, which was the Bristol link with Nicaragua. And we hosted the event with the support of Waitrose Cafe. And it was an amazing evening. And I felt that through the Pill group and, having our launch event, that it really opened my eyes to the products that I'd been enjoying, but never questioned where they came from or who produced them and so on. You'd put bananas on your cereal, you'd have tea and coffee, enjoy your bars of chocolate, but I never questioned. I might have occasionally looked when I could afford it to see if something was organic. But we set forth anyway with our group, and each year the Fairtrade Foundation have a Fairtrade fortnight. And we always put up a stall and met in different places, including in the Methodist Church, to try and raise the profile and awareness of fair trade. We were then approached and asked if we would help with the summer show, which used to be the flower show. And the WI run the refreshments tent there, and asked if we would provide a team of fair trade volunteers, and indeed if we could arrange a donation of fair trade tea and coffee. And one of our group members was a co-op pioneer, and through her good offices and also the co-op in the marina, we were able to secure some free to them fair trade teas and coffees. And we also put up our stall as part of the refreshments tent. And that was a great way of kind of raising awareness. And we, as I say, we continued, we also tried to make links with schools, and Pat really picked that one up. But it was very difficult. I think we all know how busy schools are, and they're planning their program a year ahead in advance. But she did get invited to one school in particular to help with an assembly. And on the day she was meant to go, there'd been a huge storm, and the school had to be closed down. So, there were challenges. But we have continued. We thought we should work in building the links, at least with one school, and then hopefully use that as an example to other schools and build relationships there. Increasingly, COVID came next, so we were motoring along very nicely and trying to meet the targets to become a fair trade town. And COVID came along, and that sort of stopped all our plans, and both ourselves and Pill and groups up and down the country moved to online activities, including online coffee mornings, where people were invited to bring their cup of Fairtrade coffee and either hear speakers or join in quizzes and so on. So we tried to keep the awareness going. And then as a consequence of COVID, the Fairtrade Foundation had tried to struggle on but had to review its whole staffing structure and had to reduce in some cases the staffing, and also took the opportunity during COVID to review the whole application process for Fairtrade towns, schools, churches, and so on. And so with feedback from existing groups, they realized they needed to try and make the process a little bit easier. Because I think the general feeling was if you couldn't meet all 5 requirements, people were holding on and holding, like ourselves, waiting to tick all the boxes before going forward. Now, and I've already started the process, it can be done online. You can add as you go along, and then finally submit when you feel you're ready to say, we think we've enough to make a start. And they're very good, very supportive. The Fairtrade Foundation has lots of resources on their website, which helps with promotion. Not surprisingly, in the last few years, the whole focus has turned towards the impact of climate change on the coffee farmers. And I think it was last year, the whole slogan or focus was on endangered foods because of the impact of the climate change. And that included bananas, cocoa, and coffee. And so when we were having our stall and doing our promotions, we tried to get that message across. And I think one of the reasons I was particularly keen on doing this work is I felt it very much fitted in with our testimony on equality. And I recognized that Fairtrade really worked to provide a fair living wage to the farmers who produce the food that we all enjoy. But also, as Sue has suggested, the Fairtrade premium was extremely important to the farmers and very well used. And the lady who was our speaker at our launch event, I mean, it was so moving. She showed photographs of her home, which she was very proud of. And it was just a breeze block, house, but with the premium, she was able to afford to put a better roof on it to make it more comfortable for her family. And also they used some of the money to bring in health services, because before that, the women had to travel quite a distance to get any health care support. Now a nurse or a healthcare worker was able to come to their village and support them. Other groups, maybe, as Sue said, think about what would help my community. And for some, it was building better roads or buying minibuses to get children to school and so on. And it also meant that if the farmers were getting paid a better wage, then the children could go to school and didn't have to be pulled out of school to help with the farming. It was interesting to hear talks from Fairtrade farmers about how they were managing climate change. And one farmer explained that they would have planted all their trees from the bottom of a mountain because it got lots of sun, and with climate change the sun no longer hit that part of the mountain and they had to move their crops further up and further up. And his concern was, when we get to the top, we'll have nowhere else to go. But also some of the premium was used to educate farmers on how to not be totally reliant on one crop, because of course if the banana crop, for example, failed, they had nothing to fall back on. And so many started underplanting, growing vegetables that would feed themselves and also give them crops to take to the market to earn some money for their families. So as I said, I just felt the whole thing was really, really positive. I was also very impressed and pleased to see that many of the coffee farmers were women. And not only were they supported in how to manage their farms and so on, but had the opportunity to go to university and learn management skills and so on. And one of our speakers one year was a younger woman who had been to university. So as I said, the whole scheme I think is incredibly impressive. And I think our early message, which is still still stands is that for a small change in our buying habits, if you like, we can have a huge impact on those who, as I say, grow the products that we enjoy. I did just make a note about yes, the idea of, we were talking about Fairtrade Village and Fairtrade Town. One of the changes to the application system is that they're going for a generic idea of Fairtrade communities. However, groups like ourselves who had already started may choose to go for Fairtrade Town. But the other thing I want to say was that through this awareness of climate impact, on one of the Fairtrade fortnights, we joined with Turn the Tide group in Portishead, and they did a beach clean, and we provided the refreshments. We baked Fairtrade cookies using Fairtrade ingredients, and provided Fairtrade drinks and so on. Had a very useful conversation, and we keep in touch. Sometimes we're able to donate a hamper to them as a prize for their volunteers and so forth. And I just sort of finished to say that one of the things Sue and I thought would be useful, Sue's already hinted at it, is for our Bristol Quakers to start thinking about embracing fair trade, and perhaps applying to become individual fair trade places of worship. What's required is really quite simple. It's largely encouraging us to have fair trade tea and coffee when we're serving refreshments. And then also, where possible, to promote fair trade, maybe having a stall somewhere, or joining in the Great Big Green Week or Fair Trade Fortnight, maybe putting on a display in the library or something like that. So it's something that we, Sue and I, would like to promote within Quakers, and is very achievable. And as I said, the Fair Trade Foundation website has fantastic resources for everything from schools to churches, and guidance on how to get yourselves there. So I'll stop for now, and you might want to pick up or add anything.
Thank you, Rosie, very much. We'll, if I can just say one or two other things, then we'll leave time for us all to talk together as well, because I think you finish at 12. Is that right? We finish at 12? Yeah. Yeah. So yes, thank you, Rosie, ever so much. I mean, really, honestly, I think Rosie undersells the campaign that is on in Portishead to become a fair trade town. It's very, very impressive, and getting really woven into the life of the town through, having quite a lot of supermarkets. So you've got an obvious place where you can garner support. One of the interesting things that's grown within fair trade over the last since COVID really, is the marketing of fair trade flowers, which always makes people think, oh crumbs, why are we buying flowers from across the world? But is very, very important. Aldi particularly is working very strongly with the Fair Trade Foundation to sell fair trade flowers. In Kenya, rose growing as an industry, particularly for women, is vast, and they are shipped, the flowers. They're not flown on the whole, but they are a vital source of income for a lot of women in Kenya. So each time I see fair trade flowers, and if you look, you'll see them more now than you used to, read what's on the label. There's normally pretty good information about where the product comes from with fair trade. And it's important to do that because, we need to be sure we can be confident in something if we're going to support it, I think. So, but it's really interesting how new products are beginning to come online. And I think that will help fair trade and the growers more than anything. I think the certification process is pretty rigorous with fair trade. It's governed by Fair Trade International, which is a really big organization. 2 million farmers working in 70 countries. So it's pretty impressive. And there are 3 parts to the international body. There's Africa and the Middle East, Asia and the Pacific, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And those 3 other international parts of the whole fair trade family are working very hard and working with government, working at the top level. And it's hard work. I mean, at the COPs, fair trade producers were there. They were there putting on very interesting seminars about their situation, about what they were doing with climate change, which Rosie has really drawn our attention to. But to get them to be in a significant part of the COP venue was just so interesting, because they were nearly always put right in the least accessible part of the site. And there was a lot of protesting and lobbying to get them more in the mainstream so that people could hear their stories. And where journalists particularly worked in support of this happening, it did happen in some cases. But, you know, it's really hard work to keep these kind of issues at the forefront. We may think it's mainstream fair trade now, but globally, it's really, really difficult. So that's why I think it's important, and that's why I think with Rosie that it's a bit patchy in Friends' support for fair trade, and I don't quite understand why, because it marries very strongly with our testimony. The Quiet Company at Friends' House are completely committed to fair trade. As much as they can, they do. But I think my own experience in Redland is that, you know, we've had bursts of enthusiasm, then we forget to reapply. And so I think being asked to do this talk has sort of re-energized me to think, what can we do either as local meetings or maybe as an area meeting to become a fair trade community? So that's something, it's going to take us a while to think about it, but it's an idea that's around. Rosie just finally has mentioned all the links now with environmental and green and sustainable groups. Fairtrade used to sort of sit a little bit separate to that, but it's absolutely in that conversation now. And also, interestingly, in Pill, which is my village, where we're struggling to run a fair trade group anymore, because I think most people have moved over into the environmental groups, and we're still making that connection so that we can keep going in some way. But we have somebody who's moved into the village who's doing a very interesting, developing as a research project, very interesting set of walks between the some of the big houses around Bristol that have association with slaving. And so he's devising these walks which link up different significant properties in Bristol. Of course, Pennybron in Pill is based in a house that was owned by a large slave owner. So he's now seeing the connection with what he's doing, with what we're trying to do with the Fair Trade Group, just in a village. So there are always new parts to the story coming in. And we do have St. Catherine's in Pill is a fair trade school. So they have managed to work very hard to become a fair trade school and meet all those requirements. So we're desperate to sort of try and keep the group integrated and going and active and lively. But we would be interested, I think, to know Friends' views at all about you know, Quaker's involvement with fair trade. Woodbrook used to be a great supporter. Used all tea, coffee, chocolate, everything, again, that they could, sugar. But I think it's a little bit patchy. But I don't want to end on a gloomy note, because I think that you can probably tell from what Rosie and I have said that we're both very enthusiastic about fair trade. And I think it's just probably time to put it over to just some final questions and any sharing of ideas. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Sue. That was. I apologise for moving out for a little while. I had someone call my door, and I had to go speak to them, sadly. But a couple of small things, I think. You know, central meeting is endeavouring to be a fair trade meeting. Sometimes we have tea and coffee, and that which is fair trade, because first Dean Smart and the warden Charles Gamble, you know, try to put that message across.
Yeah,
we have a lot of people who use the meeting, and sometimes will bring stuff in which is
yes,
especially Nestle stuff, which I get a
I know.
But that's an ongoing thing for us, I think, you know. But the other thing, which I had, was that if you go into any supermarket nowadays, you will see lots of thing saying fair trade, fair trade, fair trade, but the actual logos on them are not in that sense of the old logos of fair trade, which we remember, but other coffee companies are doing their own thing type of thing. And you sometimes wonder, is this real fair trade? What are your views on that?
Yes, I think it's really interesting, Ray, what you say, and I'm really glad that, I mean, we're the same at Redland. We try and then we lapse a little bit. This is very common in churches and everywhere. And I think actually applying to become a fair trade place of worship, which is not complicated, but commits you, is one way I'm thinking we really need to do that, because we should be one officially, and then we would have to be more rigorous with ourselves. So you know that I absolutely understand what you're saying. As far as the other descriptions of fair trade, yes, there's been a recent move very much for people to work, it's interesting, with very small operations in coffee particularly. A lot of the coffee roasters in Bristol want to know exactly where their coffee is coming from, so they develop a relationship with one coffee growing undertaking, and they possibly are being very fair in the way that they trade. I don't always know, but I think that that is a bit of a difficulty, and we need to have conversations. There are people working really hard on that. Devon is a fair trade county, and they are working very closely with a lot of coffee roasters in Devon to sort of keep this idea of a really personal relationship with the people you buy from, but go for certification as well, so that we know that the standards are being met, because it's a bit of a grey area otherwise. So I think it's something that's ongoing. And sometimes the words or word fair trade are used very, very loosely. So, you know, having the strict rigor, it's very hard for a coffee grower to reach fair trade certification. It's not easy at all, because they have to meet eco standards now, sustainability standards. They have to be part of a cooperative. They've got to prove quite strongly for getting the mark. And also the mark now is sometimes the big one that we had on the slide at the end of the Cuban photos, but there are also different ways of using the mark, which is legitimate, where not all of whatever you're eating has been produced on a fair trade cooperative. In order to boost volume of sales, sometimes there has to be a mix of some fair coffee, for example, that's grown, but it's not fair trade certified, mixed in with coffee that is, and it's all clear on the back of the label how that works, but it's quite a complex concept. But if fair trade hadn't gone down that route, some of the growers were just not getting enough trade. And so it's a trade-off between bulk, volume, and certification. And as an experiment, some of these other arrangements have been made. It's always clear on the label what you're buying, so you need to look at that. But they are legitimate schemes within the Fair Trade Foundation. And this is to boost volume of sales.
I was going to say, so I mean, it's great, as has been suggested, there are so many more products available in the shops, and I think people are trying to get their head around how come some of the logos are a paler color or only in black and white or whatever. And as Sue was saying, I mean, I was delighted to discover recently that I could buy jam in Marks and Spencer's, and it had a fair trade logo on it, but only the sugar was fair trade.
Yeah.
But even that's really worth buying, and you're thinking, I know I'm doing good by purchasing that product.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So looking out for any of the labels that say fair trade, because they've had to earn that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Rosie. That's so clear and so important. Yeah. Just coming up to 12, friends. Anything else that anybody wants to say?
We can go on a bit longer if necessary. We have gone on to, 15, 20 sometimes.
Really? Right.
So I'm quite happy for people, and I think my friends as well are quite happy to sometimes say that yes, with the talk that David gave last week was about 15:15, wasn't it, David?
Yeah, and we went on even longer the week before, so it does happen.
Right, okay.
I'm peripherally involved. I was with an environmental group that was talking about zero emissions production, and they were involved with the coffee producers in Colombia, and I ended up working at the World Expo in the year 2000 with a pavilion made by Colombians from bamboo, selling a kind of fair trade coffee, because it was made by the Cafeteros de Colombia, and alongside that, so there's also organic certifications, and I wonder, slightly with a little bit of a wry grin, I wonder to what extent some of these things are sort of almost a sort of Western do-gooder thing being imposed on former colonies, and how we can, if that's in the minds of people, and what we can do to improve everything for everybody in the world, really.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the colonial links are clear, aren't they? In the kind of products that we know are embedded into the culture, and now people are reliant upon them. As Rosie's saying, sometimes it's under threat through climate. The thing about fair trade that encourages me is that globally it's majority owned by producers, that Fairtrade International. I've just looked on the board of Fairtrade, the Fairtrade Foundation, which is the UK part of Fairtrade International, this morning, and the representation is quite broad, with producer representatives on that board, and certainly at Fairtrade International level, it's very much the voice of producers is a very strong voice. So I'm encouraged by that, but I agree with you that you can't just rest on that, and the way that the relationships grow, I think, between the producer end and the end that we see as consumers, really has to be strengthened. We've had in Pill, we've had visitors, fair trade farmers for 2010 we were certified, and we've had, I think until COVID, we'd had a visitor every year from Nicaragua with the Bristol link, or from Peru. And we had a young woman from Peru who was involved in cocoa production, and she'd been to university and she'd done a degree, and she was in touch with a lot of producers in Peru, but they'd never really thought about how their produce was marketed in this country, and we took them to supermarkets, to co-ops mainly, because at that point the co-op was absolutely behind fair trade. I have to say it's a bit less obvious now in co-ops, which is another thing we need to work on. But her name was Pamela, and she came from Peru, so there were 2 P's, and she visited Pill. There was the third of the P's, and we walked into our village co-op, and on the shelves was her chocolate bar. She took it off the shelf, and it said on the back, the cocoa in this chocolate bar has been produced in, and then the name of her cooperative, in Peru. Well, I mean, the place was just, she was just explosive in her realization that what she's helping to be produced in Peru was on the shelf of a shop in this village, that she might never have visited. Obviously, it was random in a sense. But it's just so important that whole equal share of the operation, wherever it's happening, is realized and revered and reiterated, because I agree, how do we make things fairer? It's really difficult sometimes, isn't it? In reality. And that's one way, I think. It's just an example, but it's a moment I'll never forget, really. So I said, as a result of that, to the Fairtrade Foundation, the producers really need to see more pictures of where their products are on show, because they should be proud of them. They're hard won, these products on shelves. And all the growing development of supermarkets stocking more fair trade things is good on the one hand, but they almost become like just anything else on the supermarket shelves if we're not careful. You know, people don't really realize the significance perhaps of most of the things that they buy, but certainly the background to anything that's got a fair trade mark on it. Just take it off the shelf and that's good. It's boosted sales, but we need to keep talking, I think, about the stories behind these products and the people who are involved in the whole operation. So yes, very interesting what you're raising, David, and I agree. It's an ongoing journey and needs reviving from time to time. And I think that's why I'm kind of becoming passionate again, because I really want to back out of the fair trade group, not because I won't support it, but because I want younger people to take it on. But you know, it needs some care in each community, and it would need it in our meetings to keep it, as you say, Ray, a live campaign. But I think if we were all fair trade places of worship in Bristol area meeting, we'd have more to say, really. So that's possibly why, because Bristol is a fair trade city, Bristol University is a fair trade university. You know, we've got some big players around in the city as well.
Lovely.
Oh,
I think you've frozen, Ray. Has he?
Yeah. Yep.
Over to you, Patsy.
I remember when I was working with. Can you hear me?
Now we can.
You were frozen for a moment, Ray.
It said my internet was a bit unstable then,
Right.
rather like me.
Start again.
Getting back again. When I was working with the children and young people group at yearly meeting, one of the things I remember persuading them to actually show to young people was the film about how bananas became fair trade in the how the growers got more from because their bananas were fair trade, you know.
Yeah. A good film, still a good film.
Don't know it. Is it on the web?
Than when they were that film.
Yes, look on YouTube, Hattie. It's all there. Just Google fair trade bananas and lots of films. But the story of the banana is particularly illustrative, I think, of what we've been talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, the young people just found that amazing. You know, we had quite a serious discussion on, you know, that what they could do as young people to promote fair trade.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, the whole system hinges, of course, in the end, on the amount of buying that goes on in countries that want to eat bananas, drink coffee, drink tea, eat chocolate. But the balance that you're pointing to, David, is very important in that process. It's not just about the buying, but that's the market. Yeah.
In their meeting. Woe is me. Hello, are you there? You're back again. You're all frozen for a moment there. Haha.
No.
But there you go. I think my machine is playing. There's a ghost in my machine. Anyway.
I was just going to add a small point. I was thinking of what Sue mentioned, Greg's, and I realized when I visited recently, I think, well, around Christmas time, that they did those sort of gift cards, gift vouchers, and I thought that would be a very handy little present. You can get one for £5, £10 when you're trying to gift somebody, and they can, you know, treat themselves to coffee or the juice whenever they have it. But also I find more and more that I like to give fair trade chocolate as gifts, and in the co-op you can get sort of, you know, a very inexpensive bar, or right through to the more sort of fancy one with raspberries and orange and all sorts of different things in it. So again, just even those gestures of gift giving that you can raise awareness about fair trade, and say to your friends, I've chosen this because, and just tell them a little story.
Yeah.
Well, I've got some really good ideas this morning. Thank you. I've been writing them down busily.
Good. That's good.
Well, dear friends, any more comments or questions? Right. In my usual thing of what is going to happen next week, and this will be Martin Smith, who will be giving us a talk which is titled "Living with History in a Pandemic."
Living with
history.
History. Right. Okay.
Martin's a local filmmaker who happens to be my immediate neighbour. And I heard him talking one day and I was so impressed. I thought, I got to get him onto our discussion group. I'm blessed if I really know what he means with the title, but he's a very entertaining man with interesting things to say.
But this is something I said I would do, and now with me standing up and saying I'm doing it now is Patsy, who does most of these talks, and I, who produce a little bit of encouragement now and then. We're running out of people to give talks, friends, quite quickly and quite amazingly. So if you know anybody who does, please speak to your meetings and say, come and give a talk on Friday. We would love to hear from you, because I am sure that there is lots of people in other meetings who have had very interesting lives or know quite a lot about something. And we would be happy for them to come along on Friday and go, about anything from stamp collecting to collecting coins, collecting strange old people. We don't mind. We just love you to come and tell them we just love you to come and speak to us. We don't bite. Anyway, friends.
People have such interesting lives. Sorry, Ray, I didn't mean to put across.
David was going to say something then.
No, just thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Sue. And
I agree. Let's get more people talking. It's a good idea. Yeah. Great. Pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.